Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 21st issue of Chebacco Chats. We're really happy to have Catherine Schmitt with us. She is an old friend of the Historical Society. She's an author, a scientist, environmentalist. She's currently the communications specialist at the Schmitt Institute, and she has written many articles for Chebacco and for other publications. Catherine, welcome. We're really glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Her article that we'll talk about today was co-written with Rich McDonald. It's part history, part detective story. It describes the growth of ornithology, the life of Henry Spelman, we'll explain who he is, and how Catherine found the bird specimens he collected on Mount Desert Island in the 1880s. But your commitment, Catherine, to science and Mount Desert Island goes back so far. We want to talk to you a little bit about your experience in Acadia. Tell us, would you please, how did you take up writing about Acadia?
Well, it doesn't go back quite that far. I moved to Maine in 2001, and Acadia was one of the first places I went when I came here, and went there often. And an essay about hiking the Precipice Trail in Acadia was one of the first articles that I had published in Maine in 2002, I think, in Friends of Acadia Journal. And then in 2008, 2009, I received a fellowship from actually what is now Schmitt Institute to research the history of Sargent Mountain Pond. So I had heard somewhere while working at the University of Maine in environmental science and doing field sampling in Acadia for environmental research projects, something about Sargent Mountain Pond being the first lake in Maine, and that really struck me and stuck with me, and I wanted to write a story about it. And I received this funding from Schmitt Institute to pursue that story. And it's really a story of climate change, sea level rise, and geology. And in researching the story, I ended up researching the history of geology and learning all of these sort of world and nationally famous geologists who had come to Acadia to study the history of climate change and glaciers and sea level rise, because that history is so visible on the landscape in Acadia. And it just sort of opened up the broader history of science in Acadia. And so from that story about Sargent Mountain Pond, I also first came upon the logbooks of the Champlain Society, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And it just sort of started me on this path of an incredible volume and diversity of stories about natural history and science in the Acadia region.
Well, I have to ask you, you said that your earliest memorable bird encounter on MBI was with a peregrine falcon on the Precipice Trail. What happened?
Oh, I heard one. So it was actually when I hiked the precipice. Before I moved to Maine, a friend had given me a book of a Maine hiking book, and one of the hikes was the precipice. So it was in my mind, like, I really want to do this hike. It was late August, so the precipice is usually closed early in the summer because it's peregrine nesting season. And so I didn't know that at the time, and was just lucky enough that I arrived at the trailhead when the trail was open. And so I don't think I knew that there were peregrines there, but while I was hiking, I heard one and saw one flying while hiking the precipice.
Those are wonderful birds.
Yeah.
And your work with the history of Acadia goes on, and I want to announce to our audience that we have an exciting project underway, and that is that Catherine is going to edit the next issue of Chebacco, our annual journal. The 2021 issue of Chebacco will be devoted to the logbooks of the Champlain Society, actually providing an annotated and illustrated transcription of their logbooks from their early years on the island. And this has been a work that's been underway for several years now with intense focus and with support of some very generous donors, many of them descendants of the Elliott family. Catherine, can you talk about what work you've done to date in what will turn out to be the 2021 issue of Chebacco?
The Champlain Society notebooks and logbooks that are in the collection of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society are an incredible wealth of information about not just what the island was like in the 1880s, but how science was done in the 1880s, and also what it was like to be a young college student doing science on the island, including some very entertaining anecdotes. And for the past 5 or 6 years, a team of us, we've been working to scan, so it's about a dozen notebooks and all covering the time period of the late 1870s to the early 1890s. It's more than 1,000 pages of handwritten 19th century cursive script. And we have scanned, digitized, and transcribed most of those pages and all of the logbooks from Mount Desert Island specifically. And those are all posted online. They're on main memory network. But I think we've all realized they're not very accessible, and there's a lot of vague references and they can be difficult to read. And so we wanted to present the information in a more readable way, in a way that's illustrated. They included photographs and hand-drawn maps in their logbooks. We wanted to capture some of those graphics with the text and provide a little bit of context and orientation for the reader. So we'll be publishing 1880 summer camp on Mount Desert Island, 1881 and 1882 summer camps on Mount Desert Island. And they'll be actual, so they're not abridged, they're gonna be the complete transcriptions.
Fantastic. It's a very exciting project, and we're really glad to have you in the middle of it to steer us through. But let's move on now to Finding Spelmans Birds, the article you wrote for the 2018 issue of Chebacco, with illustrations such as this one by Jennifer Steen-Boer. Would you read us a section of your article?
Sure. Just gonna read from the very beginning, and it opens with a quote by Robert Henry Welker from the book Birds and Men. "No man who concerns himself with birds can do so without having or developing an affection for them. The birds are real, feathered skins reshaped with cotton stuffing. They are nearly whole and vibrant, bright orange crowns, yellow rumps, hints of iridescence in the blue, downy fluff of a sandpiper chick, rusty-tailed hermit thrush, bright yellow bellies, round white spots on a black back. Their legs are crossed, tied just above the feet with wire, and tags printed with collection of Henry Spelman. Beneath, in handwritten script, are the scientific names of the birds and the locations where they were collected between 1880 and 1883 on Mount Desert Island, Maine. In the quiet air of a Harvard basement, their song reached across a century and more to pierce the silence with their story. Henry Spelman was a founding member of the Champlain Society, a group of Harvard students who surveyed the Mount Desert Island environment in the 1880s. The society kept daily records of their activities, the flora, fauna, geology, weather, and other natural characteristics they observed and sampled. The logs held by the Mount Desert Island Historical Society have been the subject of study and writing for one of us, myself, since 2009. Specimens collected by the Ornithology Department were described in the logbooks, but their whereabouts were unknown. We wondered, could they still exist?
That's a great introduction. And I want to, as we go on here, I want to invite our audience to send us your questions and thoughts. You can use, if you're watching by Zoom, you can use the Q&A function or the chat function. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, just put a comment, and we have our eyes on both of these sources. So we'll get those questions in at the end of our presentation here. Catherine, then Henry Spelman is at the center of this. Who was he?
Spelman was a Cambridge boy. He was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he went to Hopkinson School, which is where a lot of it was a prep school for Harvard at the time. He entered Harvard in 1879 at the age of 17. And his father was president of the Mount Auburn Cemetery, which was the first, if not among the first, garden cemeteries that was actually designed to provide bird habitat. And when he was a teenager at 16 years old, Henry Spelman was collecting birds around his home in Cambridge, Belmont, and Beverly. And at Harvard, he ended up pursuing law, getting a law degree from Harvard after graduating.
Okay, and he was part of the Champlain Society, and though a lot of people are up on top with that, why don't you tell us about the Champlain Society and why you spent so much of your life with them?
That sounds kind of depressing. They were a group of college students, young men, although they did interact with women, and women do become part of the story after the first few years. And they were all students at Harvard. They were ranging in age from 17 to 22, 23 years old. And they were led by Charles Eliot, who was the son of Harvard President Charles William Eliot. And the Eliot family had been coming to the Mount Desert Island region and camping on Calf Island in Frenchman Bay since 1871. And in this winter and spring of 1880, President Eliot and his wife were going to go to Europe for the summer. And so they offered the use of the family sailboat and the camping gear to young Charles and his younger brother, Sam. But I think the advice was, you can have the yacht and the camping gear, but you have to do something useful with your summer. You can't just go and sort of hang out for the summer. And so Charles proposed a natural history society that people would pledge to come for a week or more during the summer, and that they had to do some science while they were on Mount Desert Island. And there were 13 people in the original first 1880 camp. They came around the end of June, early July. They set up their camp in Northeast on Somme Sound in Northeast Harbor, right near the outlet of Hadlock Brook. And they spent the summer surveying the plants, the geology, the birds, the insects, the marine fauna of Mount Desert Island from their base camp. They would go out every day on hikes and sails and walks and document the things they saw and collect specimens that they found. And they documented all of this in the journals, which are what the collection is, and which provide all of the background and reference material for the stories we're sharing today.
So tell us about the long-term impact of the Champlain Society. They just weren't here and gone. Their influence was profound.
Yeah, they returned every summer throughout the 1880s in different assemblages, but always a core group, including Charles Eliot and also Edward Rand and Sam Eliot were some of the core members who came back every summer. But even right away after the first summer, over the course of their hiking across the island and looking for plants and birds and other specimens, they noticed a lot of destruction of forests, logging and clearing for resort and tourism development. And so they sensed that the island environment was at risk. And in their logbooks, they talk about the need to protect the island. And this carries throughout their letters and journals, and also articles that Charles Eliot and Edward Rand ended up publishing. And Charles had some of the same concerns about areas around Boston. He saw that a lot of what was left of wild areas were disappearing in Massachusetts. And so he, in the early 1890s, founded the Trustees of Reservations in Massachusetts, which was the first land trust in the world. And then Charles died when he was only 37 years old. And after he died, his father, Charles William Eliot, was going through his son's papers, found these logbooks of the Champlain Society, saw their expressions of concern for the island. And these were conversations that they had also had. Northeast Harbor residents had conversations about what to do about destruction of the island environment. And so Charles William Eliot then got with George Dorr and used the model of the trustees of reservations in Massachusetts that his son created to create the Hancock County trustees of reservations in Maine, which acquired the properties that then became Acadia National Park. So it's kind of a long way of saying that the seeds and the idea and the sense of place that the Champlain Society developed in doing science on the island at a young age eventually led to the protection of what became Acadia National Park.
Very good. And
sort of a long answer, sorry.
No, that's okay. It's important to set that foundation, I think. But well, let's get back to Henry Spelman. Can we see him in this photograph? It's not the best image.
Yes, he is the second from the left, and he's actually holding a shotgun, and he always wore, it's kind of like almost looks like kind of a round, in some photos it looks like almost like a sailor kind of hat. And so he's second from the left, seated. Okay.
And how did he collect his specimens?
With a shotgun. That was the traditional way of collecting in the 19th century. You sampled things by killing them and preserving them and bringing them home and displaying them in a cabinet or storing them in boxes and drawers.
And one of the things you do in your article is you set a historical context for Spelman's work and the role of scientists in this era, and touch on the foundations of ornithology. And you talk a lot about Audubon. Can you sort of tell us how the science of ornithology developed? Like a lot of disciplines that are now separate, I think certainly birds were important to the Wabanaki people, whose homeland included Mount Desert Island, and there's a lot of Wabanaki stories about birds, and birds were also a resource that were eaten and consumed. And then when colonists and settlers came, like other aspects of the nature of North America, they were overwhelmed by the abundance of bird life that was here, and also different kinds of birds than they knew from back home. And so in that era of exploration, there was a lot of interest in documenting the flora and fauna of the North American continent. And so that's sort of the legacy that emerges. I mean, of course, birders will tell you that birds have a special magic to them. They fly, and I think that, they're colorful and they're migratory, and so their seasonal movements are sort of especially enchanting to people. And so that was part of the tradition in the late 19th century that Spelman was continuing, just this attempt to document what species existed where in North America. Okay. So how did Spelman develop his interest in birds? He started birding as a young age. I can only think that it was related to his father. So Mount Auburn was creating bird habitat was part of the motivation for Mount Auburn, where his father was president. So and we have specimens, there's documentation of specimens that he collected at a young age. He was actually one of the youngest members of the Nuttall Ornithological Club. It was sort of the first bird club of its kind. At that time, it was closed to women, but it was a space where men with a serious interest in birds would get together and discuss bird sightings, bird namings, bird behavior, and they would also publish notices about their sightings and other information about birds. It was sort of the beginnings of a scientific society devoted to birds, and Spelman was a member as a teenager. Well, as I mentioned earlier, part of your role in this project was to discover these specimens long after they were stored away. Tell us how that happened.
Over the years of working with the logbooks and doing the transcription and reading them, there was always this thing in the back of my mind, like, where are his specimens? So the logbooks talk about how there's mentions of him so at night he would come back and process the birds, and in order to preserve them, you would have to skin them and use chemicals, and then sort of stuff the bird and sew the skins back together. And there's they talk about Spelman, stuffing birds at night at Camp Pometic, and then him bringing a box of stuffed birds back home when he left camp at the end of the summer in August. And so there was always this sort of, what happened to his specimens? Like, where are they? And I never found a lot about Spelman himself through online searches. And I don't remember what I was searching for, but it was in 2017, I came across a website called iDigBio, which is a global center for portal to digitized specimen collections. And in there was the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology's collections, which is where Spelmans birds ended up. So somehow I stumbled upon this database, searched Spelman's name, and up came a list of specimens collected on Mount Desert Island in the 1880. And that was sort of, one of these aha moments that the slog of archival historical research sometimes offers up like a gift. And so that was very excited. And then from there, I think we were all like, we got to go see them. And so we were able to, as part of this, our effort to publish the logbooks, which will be Chebacco 2021, we're researching all of the members of the Champlain Society. And so Spelman, and also Charles Townsend, which was another member of the Ornithology department of the Champlain Society, were sort of the first two to really dig into their biographies a little more in detail.
Well, and here you are.
There I am.
Experiment.
That's
So
my hand holding one of Spelman's birds.
What did that feel like?
It's pretty hard to describe it, especially because I think the opening of the article, like, they're so real. I was just surprised at how the colors, you can even see in this photo, the colors are still so bright, and the way that they're stuffed, they just look so real. Like, they're not, so I was really just sort of surprised by that. And then, the tags have handwriting on them. And it's really difficult to describe the feeling of holding something that's, 140 years old, that you've been reading about and thinking about for several years.
I think many of us who write about history know that feeling a little bit.
Yeah.
Often it's in encountering a photograph or a letter.
Or a letter, yeah, letter.
So let's get to the larger context of the work of the Champlain Society, and for that matter, your work and other scientists today. What is the importance of these historical records for scientists now?
There's a clear value in having a data set from 140 years ago, because it helps us document change. So at Schoodic Institute, we're really focused on studying environmental change, and data so having preserved specimens and the data that goes along with them helps us see how, for example, the bird populations in the Acadia region may have changed over the last 140 years. Certainly that's been done with the botany data from the Champlain Society that ended up becoming the flora of Mount Desert Island. That's been used to look at changes in plants on the island. And there's more data sets, and hopefully next year we're going to be trying to get more science looking at Champlain Society data. And the other thing is, it shows, I think, the Champlain Society shows that anybody can do science. So another thing at Schoodic Institute that we're very focused on is engaging people in the science and making citizen and community science a very inclusive process. And the Champlain Society, even though they were young white men from Harvard, they still demonstrate how anybody can participate in science and be part of generating knowledge. and that's not an exclusive domain at all.
Mm.
So two really big lessons. And then, just the objects themselves. So the scientists are interested in the data, but I think there's this broader story that, I initially found these birds through a scientific website, but to me, it's the names that go with the data that are really of value. So you can build a timeline of who has been doing the science, and then you can research those people, and it's through the stories of the people doing the science that it really, I think, becomes interesting to a broader audience of people.
Well, we want to get to questions, but we know that one question people often have is what became of the members of the Champlain Society? And why don't you tell us about Henry Spelman? What did he do later in life, and what is his long-term legacy?
So he was a really active member of the Champlain Society. So a lot of them became lifelong friends, and Spelman certainly was one of the core group who continued to go to meetings. They got married and had children, but continued to meet. So he stayed involved. And then he did become a lawyer. He had an office in Boston. He got married to a woman named Amy Lewis, who was from Cincinnati, Ohio. They had 4 children. And so he practiced law, and then birding for him became, like for a lot of people, because these different sciences had not sort of branched into different disciplines, and it wasn't a profession for most people. And so his day job was being a lawyer, but he remained connected to the Nuttall Ornithological Club, continued to go birding, and sort of birds continue to be a lifelong interest, and we would call it today a hobby, but I would say it was more than that throughout his life.
Well, at this point, we want to invite questions from the audience. I know we have some. Carl Little can always be counted on for a good question. He says, 2 of my favorite terms in Catherine's article, oologist and peeps. Did you study ornithology to write the piece?
Did I study ornithology? Yeah, so there's a couple really good popular histories of ornithology that I referenced in the book. So Scott Weidensaul has one, and then there's a couple other ones that are cited there. But I'm not an ornithologist, and I'm not a very good birder either. I'm nearsighted, so I actually have trouble bird watching, which is actually why sea ducks are my favorite in the winter, are my favorite birds to watch, because they don't move and you can you can see them really well. So it's great to have people so that's why I pulled in Rich McDonald who helped as a co-author, because he helped with the technicalities of birding. And at Schoodic, I rely on my colleague Seth Benz a lot for the ornithological details. But I did read histories of birding and Audubon, and I read Audubon's journals because I was trying to find out if he ever actually came to the Acadia region, which I haven't seen anything. He did go to Eastern Maine and Canada, but I don't think he ever came to Mount Desert Island.
Ron Epp asks, do you know how these logbooks came into the possession of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society?
They were donated by a descendant of Charles Eliot, the Eliot family. They were donated in the 1990s, Ted Eliot. Yeah. All
right. And have you found any connection between Spelman and Audubon Society founder George Bird Grinnell?
No, the people, so William Brewster, who was at Harvard, he really stayed, he didn't stray far. Spelman stayed in the Cambridge area. I'm just gonna look at my notes here. So you see him communicating with William Brewster, and then a Forbush is mentioned, which might be Edward Howe Forbush. So he seemed to be more Massachusetts, sort of northeast. Charles Townsend, who is also in the article and was a Champlain Society member, he seemed to go a little farther afield and made additional birding trips beyond Massachusetts, but I didn't see Grinnell mentioned in any of their correspondence, which is at Harvard.
Well, Catherine, we are out of time already. And you did a great job of taking us through this big topic in a very concise way. I want to thank our audience for your questions and for watching this so attentively. Next week, we have the pleasure of interviewing Will Thorndike. He wrote an article titled Three Buildings, the Iconoclastic Robert W. Patterson. A really insightful and interesting look at the work of this architect. So please join us next Thursday at 4:30 for the 22nd issue of Chebacco Chats. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us. If you're watching this on record, audience, please put a question in YouTube or in Facebook Live or email us and we'll try to get an answer back to you. So Catherine, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.